York folklore can be a bit tough to search for on Google because it often tries to direct you to New York, as if the old one doesn't exist, which is a little bit silly. As it is, the Ghost Research Foundation International even labelled York the most haunted city in the world in 2002. Every pub boasts its own ghost, trying to claim the title of most haunted pub in York. And it is true that York does have some spectacular ghost stories. A particular favourite of the ghost walks around the city is the encounter between a heating engineer and a spectral Roman legion marching through the basement of Treasurer's house in 1953. Much is often made of the fact that Harry Martindale could only see the soldiers from the knees up as they marched along a road that no longer existed. But it would be far too easy to dwell on the ghost stories of York. Let's explore some of the wider folklore of this picturesque English city instead in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. This is the second in our Folklore of Northern Cities theme. Obviously, we did Sheffield last week. We're just going to jump straight into the episode because York is a really interesting place. Like I said last week, it's only like an hour from me on the train, so it's quite easy to get to. And it is quite an interesting place to visit if you haven't been before. But we're going to start off, because we're not looking at the ghosts, with quite a cool little snippet of the folklore, and that is to do with the cat statues, because 23 cat statues stand guard on walls or rooftops around York. Well, Secret York says that there are at least 23. According to one legend, anyone who sees all of them is cursed for the rest of their life, so who would be brave enough to check that there are 23? Now, the York Glass shop clearly doesn't believe in such a curse, and they actually sell York Lucky cats made from glass, and you can follow the York Cat Trail, which is available from their website. And their free leaflet actually provides a trail to follow if you want to find the cats, although I should point out they only note 22, so it'd be interesting to know how many there actually are. Now, the shop's website theorises that the original statues were to scare off mice or rats that can carry disease, while some intended the statues to ward off evil spirits as well. And to be fair, this would be absolutely no surprise given the appearance of mummified cats within the walls of old houses. While some assume that these cats crawled into a cavity and got stuck, Brian Hoggard notes those found with wires to keep the cat posed as if hunting mice. Perhaps these dried cats acted on a spiritual level to ward off evil spirits rather than actual mice. Now, the York Glass shop thinks that these cats' original intention was to bestow luck on the medieval city, but somehow they've passed into York folklore as part of a curse. Now, I couldn't find anything about the origins of the curse superstition, so I've no idea where that came from or even when it started. So if you know anything more about that, please do feel free to leave me a comment, because I would quite like to dig into that a little bit further. And we are going to go from one type of statue to another, and if you've ever come across any of my work on Newcastle's Vampire Rabbit, or indeed seen the hundreds of photos of him on my Instagram, you will know that I do have a fascination for weird statues. And as well as the cat statues, York also has the Wmgate Devil, which to me sounds a little bit like a weird superhero or an vigilante or something like that. And basically it's on Stonegate, because a printer shop once stood at 33 Stonegate, which was an area known for printers and bookshops in the 16th century. That's my kind of place. But this carved red devil is a throwback to that particular era, because this was a time when businesses would use the wooden effigies outside their shop to advertise what they did as an early form of branding. Remember, this is also a time when you didn't quite have mass literacy, so you could literally see what someone did by what they had outside their shop. Now, you might wonder why a devil would automatically say printer, and for some people, the workers operating the presses would end up with really blackened fingers, obviously because of all the ink. And if you've ever used like cheap newspapers, you know how much that ink comes off on your hands. And because of this, some people apparently link them with the dark arts. However, printers also had their own folklore, and they actually claimed that a demon haunted each printer's shop. And these demons, which actually sound a little bit more mischievous than actually demonic, inverted type, they would remove lines or misspell words. And the acts of these printers' devils eventually got transferred to the printer's own assistant, and the assistants then became known as printers' devils. So in some ways, they're kind of a little bit like a forerunner to the idea of the gremlin, that you could explain the mistakes that were then found in printed material, that it wasn't you that had made the mistake, because it had all been fine when you left it was the printer's devil that had done it, which is quite interesting. But while the printing press is obviously long gone, the devil has remained, and some urban legends claim misfortune will befall you if you look into the devil's eyes. And again, there's lots of photos of him online as well, so there's a lot of people who will have had bad luck befall them, because you kind of have to look into his eyes to take a photo of him. Anyway, I couldn't feature York folklore and not include one of my favourite street names ever. Now, I did include this in the Folklore of Street Names episode, and I really do feel like I should do another one of those because they're always really fun. And I could do some more pub names as well because there's some really, really weird ones. But anyway, as for this particular episode, no one really knows where Wmgate got its name from, and it is one of the shorter streets in York, but it's just such a fun name to say. Wmgate, it's brilliant. And some think its original name was actually Witnoa Gate, which actually translates to What a Street. And other people think that York's whipping post actually stood here in the Middle Ages, so like the Whatma bit kind of takes on a slightly different tone in that regard. Other people think it basically means not one thing nor another, because if that's true, it makes it the most liminal place in York. Liminal places are usually crossroads or other spaces that aren't one place or another, so it's kind of the place that's like betwixt and between, as some people would put it. So like doorways are traditionally liminal, where you're not in one room or the other, or a gateway would be liminal, where you're not in the street but you're not actually in the person's garden yet. It's like that point in between. So some people think that that's basically what Witmgate essentially refers to. And because it does connect to other streets, it is a between place of sorts, although to be fair, you could say that about a lot of short streets. So I'm not sure how much I believe any of them. But wherever the name came from, the gate part of the name actually comes from the Norse word for street garter, so it's not an actual gate. And obviously bearing in mind that York used to be Jorvik when it was a Viking settlement, so that would make sense. But I do think that the general weirdness of Witmgate kind of qualifies it for a place in York folklore all the same. And we're also going to move on to something which, again, I've covered before, but I thought it was worth including in the context of York, because I heard this on a ghost walk in York, and it's a tale of being buried alive, or premature burial, whichever way you want to put it. And it was quite interesting to hear it on a ghost walk, and also find it in a 1901 book about folklore called County Folklore. Now, as the legend goes, a wealthy woman died in sort of quite mysterious circumstances, and her family buried some of her jewellery with her. And always remember, whenever you come across body snatching stories, you're allowed to steal the body because no one owns that, but you can't steal what they're wearing or indeed any jewellery, because that's theft, because it is actually owned by someone. So that's just something worth bearing in mind. Now, the sexton knew that they'd actually buried some of the jewellery with her, so he opened the vault after the funeral. But alas, the fingers had swollen and he couldn't slide the rings off. Sort of not willing to give up at this point, he decided he would cut off her fingers and get at the rings that way, as you do. But unfortunately for him, but fortunately for her as it turns out, she actually suffered from catalepsy, so she wasn't actually dead, she was just merely in such a kind of catatonic state that it looked like she was dead. Now, the injury to her fingers actually broke her trance and brought her round. So obviously the sexton's then suddenly confronted with this corpse opening their eyes and sitting up, not having any idea where she is or why she's there. The sexton probably quite understandably freaks out and then bolts in fright. And the woman just kind of gets out the coffin and goes home, which I think is fascinating. How would you describe that when you knocked on the door and your husband's like, oh my God, what are you doing here? I mean, I would love to be a fly on the wall for that particular conversation. But according to the story, the woman then lives for many more years, although hopefully she does manage to actually get the rings off her fingers herself. Now, as fantastic a tale as it is, I can't help thinking it is just an early urban legend about being buried alive, because I also heard the exact same story on a London ghost walk, and this one had relocated it to the city of London. And in both versions, the hapless resurrected woman and the thieving sexton remain nameless, and that, my friends, is always a sure sign that you're in the presence of an urban legend. If it hasn't got any specifics, you do have to be a bit suspicious. So I can't help thinking this was some kind of story that obviously swept the nation at some particular time as part of some kind of either moral panic or just general paranoia, and it's then been turned into a story which gets attached to the city through its folklore. But it is quite an interesting story, but yeah, probably unlikely to be true, which is a bit of a shame, really. I do quite like the fact there's a weird happy ending in it for the woman, though, that actually if it wasn't for the sexton being a thief, like, she wouldn't be woken up. So he actually does her a favour in a weird kind of way, and he doesn't profit from it. I imagine that would probably put him off grave robbing for the rest of his life. But yeah, interesting story. Now we're going to move on to the next one, and every city needs a good witch story, and I do mean as in a good story about a witch, not a story about a good witch, and York is no different. Now their version tells the tale of Mary Bateman, the so-called Yorkshire Witch. Now she'd actually left York in disgrace, having worked as a servant, and then ended up in Leeds. Mary started fortune telling there, although the records claim she actually conned people out of their property using her powers. Now that would be bad enough, but apparently, to make it worse, she also poisoned people to cover up her fraudulent crimes. Now she was actually hanged on the 20th of March 1809 at York Castle, and yes, that is obviously a lot later. It's after the next passage of the Witchcraft Act, and that's where, because that's passed under Queen Anne, and the idea is that witchcraft is then seen basically as fraudulent activity, that you can't say that you're a witch or a sorcerer or a conjurer or whatever, because these things aren't real. So therefore, anyone who says they can use these powers must be doing it for fraudulent reasons. So it does carry a different sort of charge to it, I guess, in a lot of ways. But also the fact that she was murdering people, I think, obviously is what explains why she was hanged and not punished in some other way. Either way, crowds of people paid to view her body, and after being dissected, they then tanned her skin and actually distributed bits of it to different applicants, which is quite gross as far as I'm concerned. But it also wasn't as uncommon as you'd think. Now, bearing in mind, this is 1809, which is before the 1832 Anatomy Act, which allowed surgeons to dissect bodies other than those of criminals. So essentially, dissection was pretty inevitable for a convicted witch. As for the skin, well, I should point out that the same fate actually met notorious Edinburgh body snatcher William Burke in 1828, and if you ever go into the Caddies and Witchery tours on Westbow in Edinburgh, you can actually see a card case covered in leather made from Burke's skin. And I'm pretty sure there's a book covered in human skin in the archives of Newcastle Central Library as well. It was part of like a bit of a weird vogue in the 19th century. Personally, it makes my skin crawl. Ha ha. No pun intended. But I think I know at least one person listening who'll be like, yeah, that's just another form of leather. So make of that story what you will. So I do think that we can't feel sorry for Mary Bateman because she was conning people and she was murdering them. But the fate that she ended up with as a result of that obviously makes it a bit ew. But the story that I wanted to end with is one that really gets my goat, and it's the infamous midnight ride to York. And generally speaking, if you ever run into legends about highwaymen, and we all know how much I love a good highwayman legend, particularly if it involves Claude Duval, then you'll no doubt encounter the belief that Dick Turpin rode from London to York in one night on Black Bess. And the York Dungeon repeats this as fact, which really irritates me because it's not true. And I should note that a few different highwaymen do get credited with the feat, so it's difficult to know exactly which one did it, but it's definitely not Dick Turpin, for the simple reason he hadn't actually been born when the alleged midnight ride happened. So we can ascribe lots of things to him because he was really vicious and actually quite evil, but he didn't do this, despite the fact that there's tons of illustrations of it apparently happening. Now, highwayman William Nevison often gets the credit and appears in Daniel Defoe's A Tour Through the Whole Island of Great Britain, which is a 3-volume series published between 1724 and 1727. Now, Defoe refers to him as William Nix, which already cast doubt on the highwayman's identity, and some people think that Defoe might have been talking about Samuel Nix, who was another highwayman. And we should remember that while Defoe was a journalist, he was also a fiction author, and he was also writing about an incident that happened 50 years earlier. So it's worth questioning these things. But in terms of the legend itself, that's a little bit more fixed, even if the identity isn't. And we'll just refer to Nevison because this is the person who most often gets it described to him. He even has a blue plaque, so we'll go with Nevison. But he robbed a man at 4 a.m. on Gad's Hill in Kent in 1676. And obviously that's why I say Dick Turpin wasn't born until the 1700s, but I digress. Once Nevison had conducted the robbery, he then rode all the way to York, changing horses along the way, and as soon as he arrived the same afternoon, he made straight for the nearest bowling green. And as luck would have it, the Lord Mayor of York was there. Nevison managed to go over and talk to him, and he contrived to ensure the mayor knew the exact time and date that he spoke to Nevison by asking him a few questions while he placed a bet. When then accused by the man that he'd robbed, Nevison produced the Lord Mayor as an alibi. Now, obviously, no one believed he could have carried out the robbery in Kent and been in York the same day. Obviously, when you've got the Lord Mayor as your alibi, that obviously helps, so therefore he must be innocent. As the legend goes, Charles II was so keen to know if the story was true that he actually offered him an assurance of a pardon, and when Nevison confessed, Charles II allegedly nicknamed him Swift Nix. Now, the royal patronage wasn't going to last long, and Nevison was soon sentenced to deportation to Tangier for another crime. Although while imprisoned in Leicester jail, he painted marks onto his skin and took a sleeping draught to create the appearance that he had died of the plague. Now, obviously, the jailers didn't really want to look too closely in case they got plague themselves, so they then carried him out of the jail in a coffin. And this is my favourite part of all of it. Nevison then took to highway robbery again, dressed as his own ghost. Which I just think, oh, that is such a bold move. But I don't know how he hasn't got his own Netflix series, but never mind. Nevison's a really interesting character because he only actually ever robbed the rich, and he had a really cool reputation for being polite and non-violent, which led some people to compare him to Robin Hood, although there is a little evidence that he actually gave his ill-gotten gains to the poor. He was eventually accused of murder, unfortunately, and executed in 1684. So while Turpin was caught and executed in York, and Turpin is part of the history of the city of York, we really do need to stop attributing the midnight ride to him because he's not part of that at all. But yeah, I absolutely love that story where he's like, yeah, I'm going to make it look like I've died of the plague so that I can escape jail. And then I'm just going to roam around pretending that I'm my own ghost. Like, I don't know. I just think it does sound like it was made up, and I like to hope it was true. But yeah, I love that story. But ultimately, what do we actually make of this York folklore? Well, there's so much more to it than I've been able to cover here, as you can imagine. And as I said in the introduction, York folklore does very much tend to stick to ghosts, whether it's spectral Roman legions marching through a cellar, or ghostly nuns drifting through pubs, or indeed workhouse owners who've badly treated the children that they work with who've then come back to haunt them. You get all these kind of stories that revolve around the supernatural. Now, I'm not necessarily sure why, given the Roman and Viking histories of York, but luckily these other tales of printers' devils, lucky cats, witches, premature burial and highwaymen all survive, and they will give you something really interesting to look out for when you're wandering the narrow snickleways and long streets around the shambles. So what I want to know is, what do you think of York? Have you been? Would you like to go? Do you live in York? Feel free to let me know, as always. If you do live in York or you're familiar with it and you know any other stories, again, feel free to post them in the comments as well, just for the benefit of anyone else who might be interested. And yeah, it's always quite nice to sort of hear additions to stories, or if you know anything about where this idea of the cats being cursed comes from, that would be cool as well. Anyway, I haven't decided actually what I'm doing next week because I haven't actually looked to see how much folklore there is. So it's going to be either Carlisle or Durham. I haven't decided yet. So you'll find out next week which one it is. And then for my final one, I am going to do Sunderland, which I think a few people have been a bit surprised about, seeing as how I'm from Newcastle and there's this like historical rivalry between the two cities. But I should point out my dad is from Sunderland, so that is why we're doing that. And Sunderland don't get enough attention really because they are a city in the northeast and everyone kind of always overlooks them in favour of Newcastle. So I thought we'll have a look at Sunderland as well. But anyway, I hope that you're well. As I mentioned last week, I am doing another talk with Cresswell Crags at the beginning of August, at this time on the folklore of magical trees. So if you're interested in that, it is free to attend. They do like donations to help cover their running costs, and they are obviously a charity preserving this like prehistoric site, but the attendance is free. So if you are interested, it will be lovely to see you there. Other than that, I hope you have a marvellous week ahead, and I will see you soon. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.